Apple just got absolutely obliterated by the courts, and everyone is going to be able to benefit from it except them. Now, as for what they did, for context, you might know that Apple charges a huge 30% cut of any digital goods purchases made through the apps on their app store. But as the Joker said in the Batman movie, it's not about the money, it's about the egregious anti-competitive behaviors against developers. Or something like that. I haven't seen the movie in a while. Joking aside though, it really is not about the percentage cut or the fact that there's a cut in the first place. It's how Apple prevents developers from offering an alternative payment mode. I actually made a video talking about this a few years ago about how Apple literally does not let developers put anywhere in the apps or tell users, for example, that there's a cheaper option if they buy directly through the site. If you look at the actual policy back from 2020, it said apps in this section, and the apps in the section are like all of them. It says either within the app or through communications sent to points of contact obtained from the account registration within the app, like email or text, they cannot encourage users to use a purchasing method other than in-app purchase. And you might be wondering, all right, like what does that actually mean? Like what are some actual consequences? For example, imagine you sign up to YouTube Premium on the App Store, not realizing that to compensate for Apple's cut, Google charges a higher price than they do if you just signed up through their website. It's like 30% more expensive. They are not allowed to tell you ever that there is the cheaper option. So imagine you as a user, and maybe this actually is your case right now, you bought YouTube Premium or another app that you're subscribed to, you bought it through the iOS app, and then you come to realize later that there's actually a way to get the exact same product for cheaper if you had just bought it through the website and not through iOS, and the seller of that app was not allowed to tell you that the option was there through like an email. How mad would you be knowing that? And for example, for the longest time, Netflix, another big one, on their app, it didn't even have an option to sign up. It literally just said you can't sign up for Netflix in the app, and just kind of implies that you have to sign up on the website because they didn't want to have to give a 30% cut to Apple. But they were not allowed to say or link, hey, you have to sign up on Netflix.com. They just kind of had to hope users would know that. It was absurd. Anyway, fast forward to the Epic versus Apple lawsuit, where, long story short, the court ordered Apple to, hey, stop doing this crap. You have to let developers have an alternative option to take users to an alternate payment mode directly through them. And Apple was not happy about this. And they complied in a way that they really did not comply. And that is the whole point of this new ruling that basically tells Apple, you willfully ignored what we were trying to make you do for anti-competitive practices, and we are not happy about it. So let's go over like what they had to do and then how they technically responded to it. So first of all, the big one was Apple was required to let developers have users do off-app purchases, like go to their own website from the app and buy it through them directly. Now, the way Apple allowed this was to say, yeah, you can do that, but we're actually going to charge a 27% commission on anything that the user then goes and buys directly on your website, or at least within 7 days of clicking the link. Unless, of course, it's a subscription, then it seems they just get a cut of it permanently. Yes, that's right. Apple allowed the external purchase that they then went and took 27% of anyway. Next, the court obviously ordered Apple to let developers tell users that there is an option and link out to the alternative payment method. And Apple complied with this by technically allowing links out, but with so many restrictions on what the link could look like and where it could be placed. And they had like a big pop-up scareware. It was a bunch of nonsense. I'll get to the details later. Oh, and what's worse is Apple excluded any developers who used this external linking feature from being able to participate in other certain Apple programs. They're like, all right, yeah, you can put links out, but you're not allowed to do all this other stuff that we offer. So in other words, Apple was already told, hey, you're being really anti-competitive. You got to let developers, let users make purchases outside and tell them that there's a potentially better option. And they went out of their way to make this as annoying and not even worth it as possible so that it basically would make no difference. So let's go into the details of like just how bad this really was, because on the surface, yeah, those are like really obnoxious requirements, but it's just even worse. In the ruling, they talk about how Apple apparently had some kind of meeting where they discussed two potential options for how to supposedly comply with the ruling that they had previously. And two ideas they had were either one, don't charge any commission on link out purchases, but limit where the links could be placed. Or the other option they were thinking about was charge a 27% commission, basically the same as in-app, but let developers put the link anywhere. Apple also talked about how they knew that the second option was so crappy that probably only the biggest developers would even bother doing it, because 3%, who cares? So guess which option you think they went with? Well, actually, no matter whether you chose the first or second, you're wrong, because they actually went with the worst of both worlds. They chose to impose a 27% commission on link out purchases and restrict where and how the links could be posted. They also apparently knew that this measly 3% discount, apparently they were calling it, would be completely offset by additional costs for developers to like set up and run this payment processing fee. It wouldn't even be viable for developers to use this option. Now, as for the placement of the links, that's even worse. They required that an external link not be displayed on any page that is part of an in-app flow to merchandise or initiate a purchase using in-app purchase. So in other words, developers are not allowed to put the link to the alternate payment method anywhere near where a user actually is going to be purchasing something. Yeah, that makes sense. And as for the design of the links, they only allowed a certain type of link called like a plain link button that barely looks like a link. It can't have any kind of shape around it or a different background than the rest of the app's background, and could only have a little link symbol next to it to signify that it was a link. And apparently in one of their meetings, they even said, how much can we limit what devs do with the text and links? But not only that, they wanted to add as much friction after a user even clicks the link as possible. For example, there's a full page scare screen that pops up. You can see it in like the Netflix app, for example. They have one of these links. You click it, it's this big long warning. And what's crazy is it only appears for external links to purchase digital goods, what they wouldn't get the cut of if you buy it externally. They do not have the same big scary warning if you go to purchase a physical good. So if it really was all about security like Apple claimed, then what difference does it make what you're going to buy? But I think this part is really the worst out of all of it, and it is from an internal Slack discussion of the developers designing this screen. They literally talked about how they would use the term external website because it sounds scary. And another employee wrote, to make your version even worse, you could add the developer's name rather than the app name. And the other person was like, ooh, keep going. And yes, as you can guess, they went with the even worse option. You can see on the Netflix scare screen, it says Netflix Inc. And apparently in a later discussion, they even talked about making it even scarier. What's even funnier though is in a later testimony, Apple basically said, I'm paraphrasing, oh, well, by scary, we don't mean like actually scary, fearful. We just mean, we just want to raise the awareness of the user. But of course, the judge basically says, yeah, no one is buying that. Now, to further increase the friction of users going to use these external links, Apple also required so-called static links, which means they couldn't include any information about the user in the URL. For example, if you're already logged in on the app, they couldn't pre-fill your information or redirect to your same account on the website so you didn't have to log in again. Instead, if a user maybe was already about to purchase something and they went to click the option to go buy it on the other site, well, then they would have to log in, maybe potentially even go find the same product, add it to the cart again, really just to annoy the user. And Apple tried to say, well, this is just for security and privacy, prevent tracking of user data on the links. However, they do not have this same restriction of static links on any other kind of link. Apparently, it's just the purchase links. So I don't know who they think is going to buy that. And on top of it all, apparently, if you were going to have an external link, you had to use one of 5 pre-made templates with pre-approved wording, and you couldn't go outside of that for what the link said. It's ridiculous. Beyond just the links, though, to even add insult to injury, like I said, Apple prevented developers from participating in other programs. such as the Apple Video Partner Program or News Partner Program, which apparently have lower 15% commissions. So like Disney Plus, it's a video subscription thing. They have to pay, I guess, less of a commission. However, if you use external links, then you are not able to do that. So you would basically double the commission. So obviously none of them are ever going to do that. And it again just restricts how many developers they're going to have actually take advantage of this thing. But the bad news for Apple is not over, because apparently they got caught lying under oath. From my understanding, Apple tried to say that, oh, the reason that we had the 27% commission and all that is because of some work group study that they commissioned to like look up the value that their ecosystem adds and some nonsense. And then that was their justification. It was because of this study that we did, something like that. And apparently when the judge ordered Apple to turn over a bunch of documents and internal discussions, like this was not even mentioned anywhere. So I believe the judge is basically saying that they lied about that and they just did it for purely revenue. And also Apple's vice president of finance testified under oath that Apple apparently had no idea, quote, what fee they were going to impose as a commission prior to January 2024. Yet the court documents also show that there were meetings where they already decided this back in July the year prior. So that was an outright lie. And you might say, oh, well, they didn't know or you forgot or something like that. But Apple made no attempt to withdraw the testimony or correct it at any point. And now we can get to the part where the judge basically slaps Apple into the shadow realm and talks about all the stuff they have to now do, saying the court permanently restrains and enjoins Apple Inc. and all its officers, etc., from 1, imposing any commission or any fee on purchases that consumers make outside an app, and as a consequence thereof, no reason exists to audit, monitor, track, or require developers to report purchases or any other activity that consumers make outside an app. So they can't charge that BS 27% commission. They can't control what the app developers talk and say to customers outside the app. No more of that. 2, from restricting or conditioning developers' style, language, formatting, quantity, flow, or placement of links for purchases outside an app. So you can't control what the link looks like. It could be big, red, green in the middle of the app that says, hey, Apple's pricing sucks. Go buy it on our website for this much cheaper, and they're allowed to do it. 3, from prohibiting or limiting the use of buttons or other calls to action or otherwise conditioning the content, style, language, formatting, flow, or placement of these devices for purchases outside the app. I think this is just more explicitly saying you can't stop developers from even having these links, not just where they put them. 4, from excluding certain categories of apps and developers from obtaining link access. So they have to allow it for everyone. 5, from interfering with consumers' choice to proceed in or out of an app by using anything other than a neutral message apprising users that they are going to a third-party site. And they even have an example. You can't have that big scareware pop-up. It's just going to be this little dialogue, for example, telling users, hey, just so you know, you're going to another site. And 6, from restricting a developer's use of dynamic links that brings consumers to a specific product page in a logged-in state rather than to a statically defined page, including restricting apps from passing on product details, user details, or other information that refers to the user intending to make the purchase. So again, they can include all the information they need in the link to keep the user like in a consistent flow, and they explicitly lay out, yeah, all these things are allowed in there. There's no room for interpretation that Apple can try and sneak around. And the judge makes it clear that there is no, hey, wait a minute, give us a minute. That says, as these are restrictions on the specific actions Apple took to violate this court's injunction, and as they require no affirmative action on Apple's part, the injunction is effective immediately. The court will not entertain a request for a stay given the repeated delays and severity of conduct. Because I didn't go over this, but there was a lot of other behavior from Apple where they were trying to purposefully delay and give excuses for why they were taking so long on all this, and the judge is not having any more of that. Now, on top of all this, the court was not happy, and they actually even require now Apple to pay Epic's attorney's fees, which is probably a pretty penny. The judge also said, should Apple again attempt to interfere with competition and violate the court's injunctive relief, civil monetary sanctions to compel compliance may be appropriate. Basically saying, hey, try this crap again and see what happens. Oh, and the cherry on top is that the judge referred the case to a prosecutor in California saying that they should investigate Apple for criminal contempt of court and lying under oath, basically. They mention Apple and the VP of Finance specifically. At the end of the whole thing, the judge sums it up. It says, Apple willfully chose not to comply with this court's injunction. It did so with the express intent to create new anti-competitive behaviors, which would, by design and in effect, maintain a valued revenue stream, a revenue stream previously found to be anti-competitive. That it thought that this court would tolerate such insubordination was a gross miscalculation. As always, the cover-up made it worse. For this court, there is no second bite at the apple. It is so ordered. And then I love how there's just a CC to the prosecutor, as if it's some kind of email. Like, hey, check this out. You might want to look into this. So really all Apple had to do was comply reasonably. I don't think anyone really would have got too much up in arms if all they had was a bunch of scareware pop-ups and stuff. But the fact that they had all these restrictions on like where it could be placed, the commission on top of it that took 27%, which is basically the same outside the app. I mean, like, how did they think this would fly? And now developers are able to just open the floodgates and tell consumers whenever, hey, you can get it cheaper if you don't buy it through Apple. And I think a lot of people are going to do that. And from my understanding, now developers could theoretically say, hey, this whole time Apple prevented us from telling you that you could get it cheaper through our site, so we encourage you to do that now. And people are going to be kind of mad that Apple didn't let them even know that. So it's going to be pretty interesting. And if you were not aware that some services you buy maybe already been offering this, but you weren't allowed to be told about it, then maybe go look at them. So I would be very curious to know what you guys think. We can talk about that all down in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to give it a big giant thumbs up, and I try to make videos about twice a week, so if you want to subscribe, it should be worth it. If you want to keep watching, the next video I'd recommend is where I found a bug in Gmail that's been around for 10 years and bugging me, and you may have experienced it too, that I figured out the problem was. So I'll put that link right there you can click on. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.